now my privilege to introduce John Lipski, who's going to be our plenary speaker this morning. John Lipski is Professor of Spanish and Linguistics and head of the Department of Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese at the Pennsylvania State University. He received his BA from Rice University and his MA and PhD from the University of Alberta. His research interests include Spanish phonology, Spanish and Portuguese dialectology and language variation, the linguistic aspects of bilingualism, and the African contribution to Spanish and Portuguese. So you can see why it's very appropriate that he'd be talking to us this morning for LAVIS 3. He has done field work in Spain, including the Canary Islands, Africa, the Caribbean, Central and South America, the Philippines, Guam, and many Spanish-speaking communities within the United States. His many books include Linguistic Aspects of Spanish-English Language Switching, The Spanish of Equatorial Guinea, Fonética y Fonología del Español de Honduras, El Español de Managua, Latin American Spanish, The Language of the Isleños of Louisiana, The Speech of the Negros Hongos of Panama, El Español de América, El Español en Síntesis, and Varieties of Spanish in the United States. He's authored more than 200 articles in all aspects of linguistics and has taught Spanish, Romance, and general linguistics, translation, language acquisition, and methodology, Latin American literature, and a variety of other language courses. He is editor of the Journal of Hispanic Linguistics. So you can see why it would be hard pressed to find anyone more eminent in the field of Spanish linguistics and dialectology. And he is here today to speak to us on a topic of growing interest. But before I announce that, I want to tell you one last thing about him. We knew that he would be the right man for the job because when we looked at his webpage, the first thing that you see is John Lipski wearing a T-shirt that has emblazoned on the front of it, "What part of y'all don't you understand?" So we know that his heart is still in the South. The name of his talk then is Spanglish, the third language of the South, truth and fantasy about U.S. Spanish. John.
Thank you. Truly honored to be on the program with so many people who've done tremendous work on the languages of this country, and I'm particularly gratified to be at a conference about language and linguistics in the South. I was educated in the South. I've taught at 2 Southern universities. I've done fieldwork in several Southern states. My children are Southerners by birth and by inclination, and I've been married to a Southerner for 33 years, so it's good to be back. Spanish first arrived in the North American mainland in what's now part of the southern United States, and the first stable contact between Spanish and English-speaking colonies also occurred in the same regions. Yesterday we heard about blues lyrics and Texas Western swing bands. I should mention that several of the old Texas bluesmen would also sometimes lapse into Spanish, and every Texas Western swing band worthy of its name in those years, Bob Wills and Milton Brown and Spade Cool and the others, would also sing songs in Spanish. Today, with upwards of 35 million native speakers of Spanish, Spanish is the de facto second language of the United States and the first language of many regions, and the United States is on the verge of becoming the world's 4th largest Spanish-speaking nation. Even today, the largest number of Spanish speakers reside in southern latitudes, and the 2000 census provides dramatic evidence that the areas of most rapid growth of the Spanish-speaking population in the last decade and a half are southern states such as Georgia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Alabama. If we leave Texas aside for a moment, the majority of Spanish speakers in southern states have arrived during the past half-century, many during the past decade, although a few long-standing enclaves continue to exist. In terms of demographics and increasingly in terms of economic and political strength, Spanish is clearly the second language of the South, mostly representing varieties originating in Cuba and Mexico, but also in several Caribbean, Central, and South American nations. In addition to speaking Spanish and usually English, Spanish speakers living in the U.S. typically exhibit a wide range of language contact phenomena that have led observers in this country and abroad to postulate that a new creation is arising from this bilingual contact. Some call it this and some call it that, but the one name that everybody recognizes is Spanglish, a word whose very morphology connotes hybridity, mixture, and to the most cynical, illegitimate birth. But what is Spanglish? Does it really exist? Can the thousands of individuals worldwide who use this term with conviction be describing a non-existent entity? Like the search for family values, democracy, and national security, Spanglish has become a deeply rooted cultural construct, highly charged with emotion, while eluding a widely accepted definition. Since neither the term itself nor the notion of a third language arising from the head-on collision of English and Spanish is likely to disappear anytime soon, it's imperative that serious empirical research complement the popular chaos that's embraced aspects of mass hysteria, conspiracy theories, and media feeding frenzy, while doing little to elucidate the actual linguistic situation of Latino bilinguals. Outside the U.S., the situation of Spanish in this country is often entangled with anti-imperialist political postures that assume as axiomatic that any language and culture arriving in the United States will be overwhelmed by Anglo-American values and will be denatured, contaminated, and ultimately assimilated by the mainstream juggernaut. Defenders of language mixing and borrowing have largely come from literary circles and from the political left, and have been frustrated in attempts to bring their views to the attention of educators, journalists, and community leaders. One common thread that runs through most accounts of Spanglish is the idea that most Latinos in the United States, and perhaps also in Puerto Rico and border areas of Mexico, speak this language rather than what might be called real Spanish. Since we're talking about upwards of 50 million people, this matter is definitely of more than passing interest. So let's have a survey of recent comments about Spanglish. There is a handout. It's really pretty small, and so I'm just going to read a few selected quotes here. But we'll start with dictionary definitions, which are typically supposed to be the most carefully researched. The American Heritage Dictionary simply says Spanish characterized by numerous borrowings from English. On the other hand, the Oxford English Dictionary defines Spanglish, quote, a type of Spanish contaminated by English words and forms of expression spoken in Latin America. The term Spanglish, or in Spanish, Spanglish, appears to have been coined by the Puerto Rican journalist Salvador Tio in a newspaper column first published in 1952. Tio, who at least considers himself to be the founder of this word, was concerned about what he felt to be the deterioration of Spanish in Puerto Rico under the onslaught of English, and waged a campaign of polemical and satirical articles over more than half a century. Many of his examples are legitimate borrowings from English, some unassimilated, that are found in modern Puerto Rican speech. Most refer to consumer products marketed in the United States or to aspects of popular culture. But Tio felt that Puerto Rican Spanish could suffer a far worse fate than simply absorbing foreign borrowings, which after all had been occurring in Spanish for more than 1,000 years. Evidently not understanding that Creole languages are formed under conditions far different from the bilingual borrowing found in Puerto Rico, he examined Papiamentu, an Afro-Iberian Creole spoken mostly in Aruba and Curaçao, and concluded that it was a degenerate form of Spanish. He warned that the same fate could befall Puerto Rican Spanish, and I quote more or less in translation, if the Spanish of Curaçao and Aruba could sink to such depths, something similar could occur in Puerto Rico if stiff measures are not taken to avoid it. Although Tio had lived in New York City and therefore had experienced firsthand true bilingual contact phenomena, he accepted uncritically others' parodies of Spanish-English interaction. For example, again quoting more or less in translation, Spanish is rotting on the New Mexican border, whereas H.L. Mencken says in the American language, two New Mexicans greet each other with this gem of linguistic nonsense. And I'll try to reproduce something that really is not a natural language. Hola, amigo. ¿Cómo le? How do you fare? Voy very well, ando, gracias. This example from Mencken does not actually come from the latter author, whose other observations on Spanish in the U.S. and its influence on English are in general well documented and factually accurate. Rather, Mencken quotes uncritically, it would appear, a, quote, recent explorer, McKinsey, 1930, whose concern for linguistic accuracy is highly questionable. McKinsey wrote during a time when Mexican bashing was an acceptable literary pastime, and although his witty anecdotes about his experiences on the U.S.-Mexican border suggest that he actually spoke Spanish, his factual account of borrowed Anglicisms stands in stark contrast to his mocking account of the language skills of Mexicans living near the border. Quote, while the Mexican of the border appropriates the words of his neighbor in a truly wholesale manner, there is neither hope nor danger that he will ever become English-speaking. It is only the bare words that are adopted. They are woven ingeniously into a fabric of grammar and pronunciation which remains forever Mexican. Although every other word Nogales or Juarez Pian uses may be English, he could not, to save his sombrero, put them together into a sentence intelligible to an American.